This wasn't an accident.
A warehouse doesn't lie. Fire tells the truth even when every person standing in front of it is lying to your face. Nandi Khumalo learned that at 19, crouched in the ash of her uncle's furniture shop in Durban, and she never forgot it. Now, 15 years later, she was about to learn that the man who owned the warehouse burning in front of her was the most dangerous person in the port city of Incheon, and that he already knew her name before she ever said it out loud. If this story pulls you in, hit that like button right now. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Stay to the end, you won't see where this goes. The fire had been out for 6 hours by the time Nandi arrived at Pier 14, and the smell of it was still doing something ugly to the back of her throat. Wet char, scorched plastic, the particular bitterness of accelerant that no amount of seawater could rinse out of a concrete floor. She stood at the yellow tape with her badge in one hand and her daughter's voice still in her ear from the phone call 20 minutes earlier, Thandi asking, with the total seriousness of a 5-year-old negotiating a treaty, whether Nandi would be home in time to watch the octopus show, the one with the cartoon octopus who ran a restaurant under the sea. Nandi had said maybe, baby, and Thandi had said okay in the voice of someone filing the disappointment away for later use, and then Nandi had hung up and put her professional face on, the one she'd built over 9 years of standing in the wreckage of other people's disasters and asking the one question insurers actually paid her to ask: does this story hold up? She had been in Incheon for 14 months. Before that, Rotterdam. Before that, a shipping insurance firm in Durban that had sent her to 3 continents in 6 years because she had a talent that made underwriters nervous and claims managers grateful in roughly equal measure. She could read a burned building the way other people read a paragraph, and she rarely got it wrong. She'd taken the sole post because the pay was extraordinary, and because Thandi's father had been gone since Thandi was 8 months old in the thorough, permanent way some men managed without dying, and Nandi had decided a long time ago that stability for her daughter was worth building somewhere unfamiliar if the money was good enough to make it real. The claim on her desk that morning had a number attached to it that made her sit very still for a full minute before she opened the file. 4.2 billion won. A single warehouse fire at a mid-tier logistics facility owned by Kim Shipping and Freight, a company registered under Kim Group Holdings, which was itself registered, for folders deep in the corporate documentation, under the personal control of a 36-year-old named Kim Min-jae. She had heard the name before she opened the file, the way you hear certain names in certain cities without ever meaning to learn them. Kim Min-jae ran what the trade papers called a Diversified Logistics and Maritime Holding Company, and what the 2 detectives she'd befriended at the Incheon Metropolitan Police Agency called, quietly, over coffee, something else entirely. Nobody said the word Mafia to her directly. Nobody needed to. She had worked enough of these claims by now to recognize the shape of a legitimate business built over the top of something else, the way you recognize a scar under makeup. The warehouse held container cargo, electronics, mostly, high value, the kind of shipment that made for a very convenient fire if a person needed one. The initial police report called it electrical. The fire marshal's report called it electrical with a footnote about the accelerant traces that didn't quite square with an electrical fire, a footnote that someone had apparently decided not to pursue very hard. Nandi read that footnote 4 times before she picked up her coat. She was on site by 10 in the morning, in boots and a hard hat, walking the scorched floor with a camera in one hand and a moisture meter in the other, and she was 30 minutes into her survey when she found the first thing that didn't fit. A poor pattern, low along the eastern wall, in a section of the warehouse that shouldn't have had any electrical load at all. No wiring, no junction box, nothing but bare concrete and the melted skeleton of a shelving unit. Fire that starts from nothing doesn't start there. She photographed it from 4 angles, made her notes in the small waterproof notebook she carried everywhere, and was crouched down measuring the depth of the char when a shadow fell across the floor in front of her, and a voice said, in English inflected with the particular calm of a person used to being listened to immediately, "You're standing in the part of the report that doesn't add up." She looked up. The man was tall, dark-suited despite the ash and the heat, standing with his hands loose at his sides the way people stand when they've trained themselves out of nervous gestures. He had a face that made you look twice and then regret it, angular and still, the kind of stillness that read less like calm and more like a held breath. Behind him, at a respectful distance, stood two other men in dark clothes who were watching her with the specific, unblinking attention of people whose job was watching. She stood up slowly, because standing up fast in front of men like that seemed like a bad first impression to make. "I don't know who you are," she said, "but I'd appreciate it if you stepped back off the site. This is an active investigation." "I know," the man said. "It's my warehouse." She looked at him properly then, and something in her chest did a small, quiet recalibration, the kind that happened when a case file's photograph became an actual person standing in front of you in real light. Kim Min-jae did not look the way she'd built him in her head from a corporate registry photo and two off-the-record comments from nervous police contacts. He looked, if she was honest with herself, like a man who hadn't slept properly in longer than the fire had been out. "Ms. Khumalo," he said before she'd offered her name. "Nandi Khumalo. Independent adjuster, contracted through Hansung Marine Insurance. 14 months in Incheon, previously Rotterdam, previously Durban." He said it without any inflection that suggested he was trying to impress or intimidate her with the information, which was somehow more unsettling than if he had. "I asked my assistant to find out who was coming before you arrived. It's a habit." That's not a comforting habit to hear about from a man standing in a burned warehouse. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of the idea of one. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it isn't." She held up her notebook, deliberately, the way you hold up a hand you don't intend to lower. "I found an accelerant pour pattern along that wall. There's no electrical load in that section. Your fire marshal's report has a footnote about it and then just stops. Doesn't follow through." "I read the report," Kim Min-jae said. "I noticed the same thing. And I would like to know who's lying to me," he said, "before your company decides whether or not to pay my claim. I imagine our interests are, for the moment, identical." Nandi looked at him for a long moment. In 9 years of doing this work, she had met exactly 4 people on the other side of a claim who said something like that and meant it. The other several hundred had wanted her gone, or bought, or both. That's an unusual thing for the policyholder to say to the adjuster investigating whether to pay him 4 billion won. "I don't need the 4 billion won," Kim Min-jae said, and there was something almost bored in the way he said it, a man stating a fact about the weather. "I need to know who set fire to a section of my warehouse that had no reason to burn." He looked past her, at the char pattern along the wall, and his face did something that she would spend the following weeks trying to accurately name and never quite manage. "That's a more expensive problem than the money." He didn't offer his hand. She didn't offer hers. But he inclined his head very slightly, the smallest possible acknowledgement of a conversation that both of them understood had just started something neither of them had planned for, and then he turned and walked back toward the gate with his 2 shadows falling into step behind him, and Nandi stood alone in the ash with her notebook in her hand and the distinct, unwelcome sensation that she had just been quietly recruited into something much larger than an insurance claim. She didn't tell anyone at the office about the conversation. She wrote her report the way she wrote every report. Clean, factual, no speculation dressed up as certainty, and she flagged the accelerant pattern as an open question requiring further investigation before any settlement determination, which was true and also, she understood even as she typed it, a decision that put her back on that pier whether she wanted to return or not. She picked Thandi up from her after-school program at 6:15, 45 minutes later than she'd promised, and Thandi met the delay with the particular theatrical forgiveness of a child who has decided the adult in question deserves one more chance. Thandi was small for 5, with a gap where her top front tooth had recently departed and an interest in facts that bordered on obsessive. She had, over the past 3 months, developed an abandoned expert-level knowledge of octopuses, volcanoes, and the Korean alphabet, in that order, and was currently deep into a phase concerning trains. She talked for the entire walk home about the KTX and its maximum speed, which she had memorized to the kilometer, and Nandi listened with half her attention and let the other half turn over the image of Kim Min-jae standing in the ash saying, "I don't need the 4 billion won, I need to know who's lying to me," in a voice with no theater in it at all. That night, after Thandi was asleep, Nandi sat at the small kitchen table of their apartment in Bupyeonggu with her laptop open and did the thing she always did before she let herself sleep on a difficult case, which was build the timeline. Fire reported at 2:47 a.m. First responders on scene by 2:58. Warehouse fully involved by 3:20. The night watchman, a 61-year-old employee named Yang Deok-soo, had reportedly been on a scheduled patrol on the far side of the facility when the fire started and had not seen the ignition. Nandi read his statement 3 times. It was a good statement, clean, specific, the kind of statement a person gives when they're telling the truth. It was also, she noticed on the fourth read, oddly specific about a patrol route that didn't match the facility's published security rotation on file with the insurer from 18 months prior. Someone had changed the watchman's route recently. She made a note. She didn't yet know what it meant. She was learning, already, that not knowing what something meant was different from not noticing it, and that the second part was the part her entire career had been built on. She went back to the warehouse 3 days later, this time with formal notice filed and a second adjuster from her firm's sole office trailing along for corroboration, a meticulous, quiet young man named Park who took twice as many photographs as necessary and said almost nothing the whole time. They were an hour into the second survey when a black car pulled up outside the gate and Kim Min-jae got out of it alone, without his shadows this time, which she understood. Correctly, she'd learn later, was itself a piece of information. "Ms. Khumalo," he said. "A word, if you have one." Park glanced at her, the look of a junior colleague silently asking whether he should be concerned. She told him to keep documenting the eastern section and followed Kim Min-jae to the edge of the lot, out of easy earshot, where the wind off the harbor carried the smell of the sea over the smell of the fire and made the whole scene feel, briefly, almost ordinary. "I have a name," he said, without preamble. "The company that supplied the accelerant residue signature matches a solvent used in a specific class of industrial degreaser. There are 11 vendors in the greater Incheon area licensed to distribute that particular formulation." He said this the way another man might have recited a grocery list, and she understood, watching him, that this was simply how he processed the world. Data first, feeling somewhere very far behind it, kept on a leash. 9 of the 11 have no connection to my company. 2 do. You've been running your own investigation. I run several things at once, he said. It's a professional requirement. He looked at her directly then, and there was something underneath the flatness of his voice that she recognized because she'd felt it herself, standing over her uncle's burned shop 15 years ago, trying to make the wreckage make sense before the grief was allowed to arrive and take the floor out from under her. "One of the 2 vendors delivers to a subsidiary managed by my cousin, Kim Dae-hyun. He sits on the council that oversees the family's holdings alongside me. He has sat on that council for 11 years believing he was owed the seat I currently occupy. You're telling an insurance adjuster that your own family might have burned down your warehouse." "I'm telling you," Kim Min-jae said, "because you're the only person currently looking at this fire who has no reason to protect anyone in it." He held her gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable, and then looked away, out at the gray water beyond the containers, and something in his shoulders settled by a small, private degree, as if he'd set something down he'd been carrying without permission for longer than he wanted to admit. "I would like your report to be accurate. Not favorable. Accurate. I have people around me whose job is to tell me what I want to hear. I don't currently trust any of them enough to know if that's what they're doing." Nandi looked at him for a long moment, feeling the particular vertigo of a job that had just quietly, without her consent, become something else. "If I find your cousin did this," she said, "my report goes to my company and, depending on what it says, potentially to the police. I'm not going to sit on evidence of arson because it's inconvenient for your family." "I'm not asking you to," Kim Min-jae said. "I'm asking you to find it." He turned to go, and then stopped, and looked back at her with an expression she hadn't yet learned to read but would, over the coming weeks, come to recognize as the closest thing his face made to uncertainty. "You have a daughter," he said. It wasn't quite a question. The shift caught her off guard enough that her voice came out sharper than she intended. "How do you know that?" "The same way I knew your travel history before you arrived at my warehouse," he said. I told you. It's a habit. He held up one hand, not quite an apology, more an acknowledgement that he understood the habit had cost him something in her estimation of him, and he was choosing to name that cost rather than pretend it away. I'm not going to pretend I don't do this. It would be a worse kind of dishonesty than the thing itself. A pause. 5 years old. A school in Bupyeonggu. You walk her home most days. He said this without any weight of threat in it, delivered flat, like a man reciting the coordinates of something he'd already decided not to touch. I tell you this only so you understand. If this investigation becomes dangerous, and I believe it may, I would rather you know that I already know where the danger could reach before it reaches there. Not so I can use it. So I can prevent it. Nandi stood very still on the wet concrete with the wind off the harbor moving through her jacket, and she thought about Thandi's face that morning, asking about the octopus show, and she thought about the particular kind of fear that lived permanently in the chest of a woman raising a child alone in a foreign country with no family within 11,000 kilometers, and she found, to her own surprise, that what she felt looking at Kim Min-jae in that moment was not primarily fear of him. It was something closer to the recognition of another person who had also spent a long time being the only one in the room doing the actual counting. Don't ever mention my daughter to me again unless you're telling me she's safe, she said. I mean that. Understood, Kim Min-jae said, and it was the first time she heard something in his voice that sounded less like a man managing an interaction and more like a man being spoken to directly by someone he had decided, somewhere in the last 4 minutes, was worth being honest with. She's safe. I've already made sure of it. That wasn't a threat, Ms. Khumalo. It was the only kind of promise I know how to make. He left. Nandi stood at the edge of the burned lot for a long moment before she went back to park and the cameras and the eastern wall, and when she finally spoke again her voice was steady, because she had spent 9 years learning how to make her voice steady regardless of what was happening underneath it, but her hands, when she looked down at them, were not. That night she didn't sleep well. She lay in the dark of her small apartment listening to Thandi's breathing through the thin wall and thought about accelerant signatures and cousins' names and a man who had learned her daughter's school before she'd learned his cousin's face, and somewhere around 2 in the morning she got up, made tea she didn't drink, and pulled her laptop back out to reread the watchman's statement one more time, because something about the changed patrol route was still sitting in her chest like a stone. She hadn't finished swallowing, and she had learned a long time ago that the things that kept her awake were, more often than not, the things that mattered most. 3 days later, the watchman, Yang Deok-soo, failed to show up for his scheduled interview with the insurance investigators. His phone went straight to voicemail. His listed address turned out to be a boarding house he had vacated 2 weeks before the fire, a fact that had not been updated in his employment file, and which nobody at Kim Shipping and Freight seemed able to explain. Nandi sat in her small shared office in Seoul with that single fact in front of her. A man who had watched nothing, given a clean statement about nothing, and then vanished before anyone could ask him a second question, and understood, with a specific, cold clarity that had guided her through every honest report she'd ever filed, that she was no longer investigating a fire. She was investigating who had wanted it. 3 weeks passed before Nandi understood how much had already changed without her fully agreeing to it. She kept working the file the way she worked every file, methodically, quietly, refusing to let the size of the number at the top of the page change the shape of the question she asked. She interviewed 2 former employees of Kim Shipping and Freight who had left the company in the past year, both of whom gave careful, guarded answers that told her more through what they wouldn't say than what they would. She pulled procurement records for the industrial degreaser Min-jae had mentioned and cross-referenced delivery manifests against warehouse staffing schedules going back 6 months. She found, on a Tuesday afternoon in her small shared office with rain running sideways down the window, a delivery record dated 11 days before the fire. 2 drums of the solvent, signed for at the loading dock by a name she didn't recognize, at 11:40 at night, well outside any normal delivery window. She photographed the record. She didn't tell her supervisor yet, a cautious, risk-averse man named Suarez who had made it clear during her onboarding that Hansung Marine preferred its adjusters to close claims quietly and litigate nothing they didn't have to. She wasn't ready to bring this upstairs until she understood who she'd be handing it to. Thandi, meanwhile, had moved on from trains to a new and, in Nandi's private opinion, considerably more alarming obsession. She had discovered, through a classmate whose father worked at the port, the concept of container ships, and had spent the better part of 2 weeks drawing increasingly elaborate diagrams of a hypothetical vessel she intended to captain someday, complete with a crew roster that included her mother, her stuffed elephant Bekani, and, mysteriously, the tall man from the burned place, a phrase that made Nandi go very still the first time she heard it. What tall man, baby? Thandi had shrugged, absorbed in her drawing, the particular unbothered shrug of a child who did not understand that the question carried any weight. The one who waved at me. At the school gate. He said hello to Auntie Miss O. Nandi had put down the dish towel she was holding and crouched to Thandi's eye level with a carefulness she hoped didn't read as alarm. When was this? Monday. Or maybe not Monday. Thandi considered this with the gravity of a scholar revising a hypothesis. He had a nice car. Nandi did not sleep well that night. She lay awake running the sentence through her head. I already made sure of it. That wasn't a threat. It was the only kind of promise I know how to make. And found that it landed differently at 11 at night with her daughter's diagrams of container ships taped to the refrigerator than it had on a pier in the wind 3 weeks earlier. In the morning she called the number Kim Min-jae had left with her office and, when a woman's voice answered instead of his, requested, with a directness that surprised even her, a meeting, in person, at a location of her choosing, not his. They met at a coffee shop near the courthouse, a small, unremarkable place with mismatched chairs and a barista who didn't look up from his phone when Kim Min-jae walked in, which told Nandi something about how carefully the location had actually been chosen after all. Anonymity, it turned out, was also a kind of engineering, and he was good at it. He sat across from her without ordering anything. You have someone watching my daughter's school, she said, without preamble. I have someone in the general vicinity of your daughter's school, he said. There's a difference, though I understand it may not feel like one from where you're sitting. She told me a man waved at her. A tall man. With a nice car. Nandi kept her voice level through sheer effort of will. I need you to understand that if anyone connected to you approaches my child again, in any capacity, for any reason, this conversation is finished. The investigation is finished. I will hand my findings to my supervisor and let your family sort out its own arson, and I will take Thandi somewhere you have never heard of. Something moved through Kim Min-jae's face, not defensiveness, she noted, filing it away the way she filed everything, but something closer to genuine reconsideration, a man recalculating a decision he'd believed was sound and discovering, in real time, that it had cost more than he'd budgeted for. That was a mistake, he said. I gave an instruction that was meant to ensure her safety, and it was executed with less discretion than I specified. I'll correct it today. He paused. I won't ask you to trust that I mean it. I'll simply do it, and you can observe whether the man appears again. He'd better not. He won't. A beat. I have a cousin, Ms. Khumalo, who has spent 11 years positioning himself to inherit what I currently hold, and who I now have reason to believe set fire to 4 billion of my own inventory to make me look incompetent in front of the family council. If he has identified that you are the adjuster on this claim and that I have spoken with you more than once, he will look for every point of leverage available to him. Your daughter is a point of leverage whether either of us wants her to be. He said this with no theater in it, the same flat delivery he'd used at the warehouse, and she understood, listening to him, that this was simply the register he retreated into when a thing frightened him too much to say any other way. I would rather overcorrect toward protecting her, and have you find it invasive than undercorrect, and have something happen that neither of us can undo. Nandi sat with that for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table, and found, to her own quiet frustration, that she believed him. Find a way to do it that doesn't involve strange men at the school gate, she said finally. Or I walk. Understood. She'd expected, after that meeting, to feel some measure of resolution. Instead, over the following days, she felt the opposite. The sense of a structure closing gently and precisely around her life. A set of invisible hands rearranging small things without asking. A second lock appeared on the door of her apartment building, installed, the building superintendent told her when she asked, at the request of a residence associate, who had paid for the whole building's security upgrade as a courtesy. Thandi's after-school program instituted a new sign-out policy requiring photo identification, which the director explained, apologetically, had come as a recommendation from an anonymous donor to the program's safety fund. Nandi found herself standing in her own kitchen at midnight, furious in a way she couldn't fully justify at a man who had, by any reasonable measure, only made her daughter safer, and she understood that what she was actually furious at was the reminder, delivered gently, deniably, at every turn, that she had stepped into a world large enough to reshape hers without her consent, and that the man doing the reshaping had, so far, been careful never to ask. Her supervisor, Suarez, called her into his office on a Thursday morning with an expression she recognized immediately as trouble arriving in a suit. "I got a call from Kim Group's legal counsel," he said. "They're requesting a change of adjuster on the Pier 14 claim." Nandi felt something cold settle in her chest. On what grounds? No grounds specified. Just a request. Said it wasn't a reflection on your work, wanted a, quote, fresh perspective given the complexity of the internal corporate relationships involved. Suarez looked at her over his glasses with the particular weariness of a man who did not enjoy being caught between a major client and a competent employee. "You want to tell me what's going on with this file, Nandi?" She thought, for a long moment, about how much to say. She thought about the accelerant delivery record still sitting, unshared, on her laptop. She thought about a man named Kim Dae-hyun she had not yet met and a fiancé-shaped absence in Kim Min-jae's life that she had noticed but not yet asked about, and a woman's name, Han Seo-yoon, that had appeared twice now in the corporate registry filings for Kim Group subsidiaries, listed as a director on 3 boards that had no obvious operational purpose. "I think someone inside the client's own organization wants this claim to move fast and quiet, and I'm not moving fast enough for them," she said carefully. "I'd like another 2 weeks before you make a decision about the reassignment." Suarez studied her for a moment. 2 weeks, he said. "And Nandi, whatever this is, if it's bigger than an insurance claim, I need you to loop me in before it becomes a liability for this firm." "Understood," she said, and meant it, and also understood, walking out of his office, that she had just bought herself 2 weeks in which the only person who could actually protect that window was the same man whose name kept appearing in her nightmares about her daughter's school gate. She met Kim Min-jae again 4 days later, this time at his request, at a private dining room above a restaurant in Songdo that smelled of grilled fish and had a view of the reclaimed land stretching out toward the water. He was already seated when she arrived, a folder closed on the table in front of him, and for the first time since Pier 14 she saw something in his posture that read, unmistakably, as exhaustion, the particular kind that a person carries not in their face but in the careful economy of their movements, as if conserving energy for something they knew was still coming. "Someone tried to change your assignment," he said, without greeting. "You know about that. I made a call this morning asking why. It came from my cousin's office, through a shell request routed to make it look like independent legal counsel." He opened the folder and slid a single page across the table, an org chart, hand-annotated, names crossed out and circled in a tight, economical script. "Dae-hyun does not want you removed because your reports have been unfavorable to him. Your reports have been, so far, entirely neutral. He wants you removed because he has assessed, correctly, that you are the only outside party currently capable of proving what I already suspect, and he would rather deal with an adjuster he can predict." "Which is who?" "A man named Ito, contracted through the same firm you work for, who handled a claim for one of Dae-hyun's subsidiaries 18 months ago and settled it favorably, quickly, without much scrutiny." He said this without any particular bitterness, simply laying the fact on the table the way he laid everything, a piece to be examined. "I am not asking you to do anything you would not otherwise do, Ms. Khumalo. I am asking you to finish what you have already started, quickly enough that it cannot be interrupted." Nandi looked at the org chart for a long moment. There, near the bottom, circled twice, was a name she'd seen in the corporate filings, Han Seo-yoon, listed under a subsidiary called Bright Horizon Consulting, itself owned, 3 layers deep, by a holding company that traced back to Kim Dae-hyun's personal accounts. "Who is she?" Nandi said. "To you." Something moved across Kim Min-jae's face, brief and controlled, the closest thing to a flinch she'd seen from him. "She was, until 4 months ago, someone I was engaged to marry," he said. The engagement was arranged by my father before his death, as a means of consolidating two branches of the family's holdings. I did not fully understand, until approximately 6 weeks ago, that Seo Yoon's loyalty in that arrangement had always run to my cousin, not to me, and that she had likely known about his intentions toward this warehouse, and toward several matters before it, for considerably longer than I have. He said all of this the way a man reads a verdict he has already accepted, and is simply repeating for the record. The engagement was ended quietly, on paper, for reasons of incompatibility. Publicly, nothing has changed. She still attends family functions. She still sits on those boards. I have found it more useful, for the moment, to let her believe I don't know than to confront her before I understand the full shape of what she and Dae-hyun have built. That's a long time to sit across a table from someone who's been lying to you. Yes, he said simply, and something in the single syllable told her more about the cost of it than a longer answer would have. She left that dinner with the org chart photographed on her phone, and a feeling she didn't have a clean name for, something adjacent to sympathy and adjacent to suspicion in equal, uncomfortable measure, and it took her most of the walk back to the subway station to understand that what she actually felt was recognition. She knew, better than most people, what it cost to sit at a table with someone who had already decided you were a variable to be managed, rather than a person to be honest with. And she knew, too, the specific exhaustion of being the only one in the room doing the real math. The next development came from an unexpected direction. 10 days after the dinner in Songdo, Nandi's contact at the fire marshal's office, a careful, overworked woman named Investigator Bae who had grown, over the course of the investigation, into something like a cautious ally, called her with news that made Nandi sit down hard in her chair. "The night watchman," Bae said. "Yong Deok-soo. We found him." "Where?" "A fishing village outside Mokpo. He's been staying with a cousin, paying cash, using a name that isn't his." A pause on the line, waited. "He's willing to talk to you before he talks to us. Says he doesn't trust police reports. Says he'll only speak to the insurance investigator because, his words, she's the only one in this whole mess who isn't already owned by somebody." Nandi took the first available train to Mokpo 2 days later, alone, against the explicit and repeated objection of Kim Min-jae, who had offered, insisted, twice, with a flatness that made clear he considered the matter non-negotiable, to send 2 of his people with her. She had refused. She had spent 9 years building a professional reputation on the specific, unglamorous fact that people told her the truth because she came alone, without an agenda larger than the truth itself, and she was not going to compromise that principle 4 billion won into a case that had already begun reshaping the geometry of her daughter's life. Young Deok-soo was 61 years old and looked older, a small, weathered man with hands that shook faintly when he poured tea in the cramped kitchen of his cousin's house, 3 streets back from the harbor, where the smell of drying fish hung in the air the way the smell of the burned warehouse had hung over Pier 14. He would not meet her eyes for the first 10 minutes of their conversation. When he finally did, what she saw there was not guilt exactly, but the particular haunted quality of a man who had done something small under enormous pressure and had been living inside the consequences of it every day since. "They came to my house 2 weeks before the fire," he said, in careful, halting English that he'd apparently practiced for this exact conversation. "2 men. Not from the company. They knew things about me, my daughter's hospital bills, my son's gambling debt. They said if I changed my patrol route on one specific night, walked the far side of the facility instead of the near side, for 40 minutes, I would never hear from them again, and my family's debts would be, how do you say, resolved." "Did you know it was for a fire?" "No." His hands shook harder around the teacup. "I thought, theft. Cargo theft. It happens. I told myself it was cargo theft, because I could live with that." He looked at her directly then, and the shame in his face was total and unhidden. "I have not slept one full night since. There were people working the night shift in the adjacent building. If the fire had spread." "It didn't," Nandi said, more gently than she intended. "This time," he said. "I don't know these men's names. But I know the car. I photographed the plate before I ran, because I am an old man and I have spent my whole life believing that someday, Someone honest would ask me the right question. He reached into a drawer in the small kitchen table and produced a folded piece of paper, soft at the creases from being handled many times, and slid it across to her with both hands, the way a man hands over something he has been guarding and is finally relieved to set down. I did not give this to the police. I did not trust who they would give it to. The license plate traced, through records investigator Bay was able to pull with unusual speed once Nandi shared what she'd found, to a vehicle registered under Bright Horizon Consulting. Nandi sat on the train back to Seoul with that single fact glowing in her chest like a coal, and she understood, watching the coastline blur past the window, that she now held something that could end this. Not just the insurance claim, not just the question of who owed whom 4 billion won, but the specific, deliberate campaign to destroy a man's business and, quite possibly, his life, orchestrated by the woman he had once been engaged to marry. She also understood, with the same clarity, that the moment she handed this information to Kim Min-jae, there would be no controlled, procedural way to deploy it. A man like Kim Dae-hyun, cornered with proof this direct, would not respond by filing a countersuit. He would respond the way people like him always responded when the walls closed in, fast, and without much concern for who stood between him and the exit. She called Kim Min-jae from the train platform in Seoul, her hand not quite steady on the phone, and told him what she had. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that she checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Not the flat, controlled register she'd come to expect, but something raw, something that sounded, for the first time since Pier 14, like a man who had just been handed proof of a betrayal he'd spent months preparing himself for and had still, somehow, hoped would turn out to be a misunderstanding. Han Seo-yoon's car, he said quietly. Not Dae-hyun's. Yes. Another silence. I need to think, he said. Ms. Khumalo, Nandi, I need you to do something for me, and I understand if you refuse. What? I need to know if you're willing to meet with me somewhere your daughter is not, and somewhere I can guarantee is not being watched, so that I can explain something to you that I have not yet explained to anyone, including my own security team. A pause. Waited with the particular formality of a man about to say something that cost him. I've begun preparing a response to Dae-hyun's campaign. It requires me to appear, publicly, considerably weaker than I currently am. I would like your help executing it, because you are the only person outside my organization who understands the shape of what's actually happening, and because I no longer trust that everyone inside my organization does not answer, in some capacity, to my cousin or to Seo-yoon. Nandi stood on the platform with commuters moving around her in the golden, indifferent rush of the evening, and thought about Thandi's diagrams of container ships taped to the refrigerator, and thought about a watchman shaking hands around a teacup in Mokpo, and thought, finally, about the specific moment 15 years earlier when she had stood in the ash of her uncle's shop and promised herself that she would never again let someone else's silence protect the people who deserved to be caught. Tell me where, she said. They met 3 nights later, in a private room at the back of a small, unremarkable barbecue restaurant in a part of Incheon Nandi had never visited, chosen, Kim Min-jae explained, because it belonged to a man who owed his mother a debt from 30 years earlier that had nothing to do with the family business and everything to do with a kindness she'd done him once, quietly, when he was young and had nothing. It was, Nandi understood immediately, the first place he had shown her that existed entirely outside the architecture of power. No security detail visible, no cameras she could identify, just a small room with a low table and a single overworked space heater humming in the corner. I'm going to tell the council I've suffered a stroke, Kim Min-jae said, without preamble, once the door was closed. Partial. Speech and motor function on the right side, expected to be temporary but uncertain in its recovery timeline. My physician, a man who has kept my family's secrets for 2 decades and will keep this one, will confirm it publicly if asked. Nandi stared at him. You're going to fake a stroke. I'm going to appear to be recovering from one, he corrected, with the particular precision he brought to every sentence that mattered. There is a difference, and the difference is the entire strategy. Dae-hyun has spent 11 years positioning himself as the responsible, stable alternative to a cousin he considers reckless and too young for the role our fathers left him. If I am suddenly, visibly diminished, unable to attend council sessions, unable to speak for long periods without visible effort, requiring assistance to move through my own house. He will not wait quietly for a fair transition. He will move. Immediately, and without the caution he's shown so far, because a diminished rival is a rival he no longer has to be careful of. He looked at her steadily. And Seo Yoon, who I believe has spent the last several months positioning herself as his instrument inside my household, will move with him. People do not maintain careful, patient betrayal once they believe the object of it can no longer see them clearly. And you'll be watching the whole time. I intend to be. Nandi sat with the enormity of what he was describing, turning her tea cup slowly on the table between them. What do you need from me? Nothing that endangers you, he said immediately, and something in the speed of the answer told her he had rehearsed it, that he had anticipated the question and prepared himself to answer it honestly rather than persuasively. But I need someone documenting what happens inside my household in the weeks that follow, who is not on my payroll, who has no reason to protect anyone inside it, and whose professional judgment I already trust more than I trust most of the people who have worked for my family for a decade or more. Your claim on the warehouse fire gives you a legitimate, ongoing reason to have access to my company's records and, periodically, to the residence itself, without raising suspicion. I am not asking you to spy for me. I am asking you to keep doing exactly what you have already been doing, noticing what doesn't fit inside a house that is about to become considerably more dangerous than it currently is. And if it goes wrong, then I will have already made arrangements to protect you and your daughter, regardless of what happens to me, he said, and the flatness had returned to his voice, but underneath it, for just a moment, she caught the same rawness she'd heard on the phone at the train platform. I have already begun making those arrangements. I would like your permission before I finish them, because I understand, now, that arranging a person's safety without their knowledge is its own kind of harm, even when the intention is protection. He paused. You told me once not to mention your daughter to you unless I was telling you she was safe. I am telling you I intend to make that true regardless of what you decide tonight. What I am asking permission for is whether you will help me end this properly, or whether you would prefer I find another way and keep you as far from it as I can manage. Nandi looked at this man across the low table, in the small, unremarkable room with its humming space heater, and thought about the difference between the version of him she'd built from a corporate registry photo and 2 off-the-record police comments, and the version sitting in front of her now, controlled almost to the point of exhaustion, carrying a betrayal he hadn't yet let himself grieve, asking her, with something that looked very much like fear underneath all the flatness, to choose. To stand near a fire he was about to deliberately set. I'll help, she said. But you tell me everything. Not the version you've decided I can handle. Everything. If I'm going to be inside this, I'm going in with my eyes open or I'm not going in at all. Something shifted in Kim Min-jae's face. Not relief exactly, she would think later, trying to name it, but something quieter and more foundational than relief. The specific expression of a man setting down a weight he had been carrying without permission for far too long and discovering that someone else was willing, finally, to help him hold it. Agreed, he said. 3 days later, the story reached the family council, delivered by a physician with 2 decades of discretion behind his name. Kim Min-jae had suffered a mild ischemic event, was expected to recover, but would require reduced responsibilities and a period of careful management. Within 48 hours, Han Seo-yoon had moved back into a guest wing of the Kim residence, ostensibly to help manage his care, and Kim Dae-hyun had called an emergency session of the family council to discuss, in language that was polite and procedural and entirely transparent to anyone paying close attention, the question of interim leadership. Nandi stood in the corridor of the residence on the morning of her first official visit as the insurance claims investigator, watching Kim Min-jae being wheeled past her by an aide, his right hand resting slack in his lap. His speech, when he offered her a slow, careful greeting, deliberately halting in a way that made her chest ache even though she knew, with total certainty, that it was a performance built to catch a fire before it could burn down everything he'd spent his life building. She thought, watching him go, about her uncle's shop, and the particular truth that fire always told, eventually, to anyone patient enough to read it. She did not yet know how much this fire was going to cost either of them before it finally burned itself out. The Kim residence sat on a hillside above Songdo with the reclaimed land spreading out below it toward the water. A house built in the clean, severe lines of contemporary Korean architecture, all glass and pale stone, deliberately unornamented in a way that Nandi understood, the longer she spent inside it, was its own kind of statement. A family that did not need to announce its wealth because everyone who mattered already knew the shape of it. She was given a temporary pass that let her move through the ground floor offices and the records room where Kim Group Holdings kept its logistics documentation, escorted, always, by a quiet young assistant named June, who had the careful, watchful manner of someone who had been told to be helpful and to notice everything at the same time. For the first 10 days, nothing happened that she could point to directly. That was, she came to understand, the nature of what they were waiting for. Not an event, but a texture, a slow accumulation of small wrongnesses that would only cohere into a pattern if someone was paying the specific, patient kind of attention she had spent 9 years training herself to pay. She noticed, on her third visit, that Han Seo-yoon had begun taking her calls in the garden, in different sections of it each time, always with her back angled away from the house's windows. She noticed, on her fifth visit, that a member of the household security team, a broad, quiet man named Cho who had been introduced to her, briefly, as the head of Kim Min-jae's personal protection detail, seemed to appear with unusual frequency in rooms where Han Seo-yoon happened to be, not overtly, but with a kind of coincidental regularity that stopped being coincidental once you started counting. She said nothing to anyone. She had learned, over the years, that the value of noticing lay entirely in not announcing it too soon. Kim Min-jae, for his part, played the role with a discipline that unsettled her more than she expected it to. She watched him at a family dinner on her 6th visit, watched him hold a spoon in his left hand with the careful, slightly clumsy deliberation of a man relearning a basic function, watched him let his speech slow and blur at the edges when Dae-hyun asked him a direct question about the warehouse claim, watched the whole table, 12 people, most of them council members with decades invested in reading exactly this kind of weakness, recalibrate their posture toward him in real time, the way predators recalibrate towards something that has begun, unmistakably, to limp. Dae-hyun was not what she'd expected. She had built him, in her head, from Kim Min-jae's description, into something closer to a cartoon villain, and the reality, a compact, soft-spoken man in his mid-40s with an easy, practiced warmth and the specific gift of making everyone at a table feel individually attended to, was considerably more unsettling. He asked after her work with genuine-sounding interest. He complimented her Korean, which had improved steadily over 14 months but remained, she knew, imperfect. He mentioned, in passing, almost as an afterthought, that he understood she had a daughter, and that Incheon had excellent international schools, should she ever be looking, and he said it with such easy generosity that it took her nearly a full minute afterward, alone in the guest bathroom with the tap running, to understand that it had been exactly the same kind of message Kim Min-jae had once delivered to her on a windswept pier. I know where the thing you love the most is standing. Dressed, this time, in considerably better manners. She texted Kim Min-jae from the bathroom, her hands not quite steady. He mentioned Thandi tonight. Casually. At dinner. The reply came back within a minute. I saw. I'm sorry. We're closer than I expected. That means he's also more frightened than I expected, which means less careful. Stay through dessert. I'll explain after. After dessert, when the family had dispersed into the various sitting rooms for the after-dinner performance of leisure that Nandi was beginning to recognize as its own kind of theater, Kim Min-jae found a moment to steer his wheelchair, real, for these hours, in the sense that he committed to it completely, into the corridor outside the library, where Nandi was waiting, ostensibly reviewing a shipping manifest on her tablet. He's testing whether I still track threats to people outside the family, Kim Min-jae said quietly, his speech clear now, none of the careful blur he'd performed at the table. If I'd reacted visibly tonight, it would have told him you matter to me in a way that goes beyond the claim. I need you to understand that not reacting was the correct strategy, and also that I hated doing it. I noticed you didn't react, Nandi said. I also noticed Han Seo-yoon watching you not react. Something sharpened in Kim Min-jae's face. Explain. She wasn't looking at Dae-hyun when he mentioned Thandi. She was looking at you. Specifically at your hands. Nandi kept her voice low, professional, the register she used when delivering a difficult finding to a client who needed the facts more than they needed comfort. I don't think she was checking whether you'd react to the threat. I think she was checking whether the stroke was real. The corridor was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere in the house, faintly, she could hear the murmur of the family's after-dinner conversation, a chandelier's worth of easy, moneyed laughter drifting down from the main sitting room. She suspects, Kim Min-jae said finally. I think she's suspected from close to the beginning. I think that's why the campaign against your health accelerated the way it did, not because your weakness gave her an opening, but because she needed to move fast enough to force a real decision before she could confirm whether you were actually diminished or simply patient. Nandi looked at him steadily. She's smarter than Dae-hyun. I think you already knew that. I think that's part of why this hurts more than the business does. Kim Min-jae was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, and when he spoke again his voice had lost some of its careful control. I've known her since I was 14 years old, he said. Our families arranged the engagement when I was 26, after my father's diagnosis, as insurance against exactly this kind of succession fight. I understood, going into it, that it was a business arrangement dressed as a romance. I did not fully understand, until 4 months ago, that for her it had never stopped being purely business, on both sides of the ledger, that she had likely been reporting to Dae-hyun's people since before the engagement was even formalized. He looked down at his own hands, resting slack in his lap in the posture he'd been performing all evening, and something in the gesture read, for a moment, as entirely unperformed. I keep waiting to feel the anger fully. I think I'm afraid of what happens once I do. Nandi thought about her uncle's shop again. The particular grief that came after the fire was out, and the adrenaline of putting it out had finally, fully drained away, leaving nothing behind but the plain, unbearable fact of what had been lost. It'll come, she said. Let it, when it does. Don't perform strength through that part. Just this part. She gestured, faintly, at the wheelchair, at the whole elaborate architecture of the deception surrounding them. This part you're allowed to fake. The rest of it, don't. Something in Kim Min-jae's expression shifted, and for a moment the exhaustion in it was so total, so unguarded, that she understood she was seeing something almost no one else in this house had been permitted to see in months. Thank you, he said quietly, and it was, she would think later, one of the only completely simple things he'd ever said to her. The escalation came 11 days later, and it came, as these things tended to, from a direction none of them had fully prepared for. Nandi's supervisor called her into his office on a Wednesday morning with a look on his face she had learned, over the previous weeks, to dread. Kim Group's legal counsel filed a formal complaint, Suarez said. 3 items. Improper documentation handling on the Pier 14 claim. An undisclosed conflict of interest. Apparently you've been photographed at the family residence on multiple occasions outside the scope of your professional duties. And, he paused, and something in his face told her the third item was the one that had actually rattled him. An allegation that you solicited a bribe from a witness in Mokpo in exchange for favorable claim treatment. The floor of Nandi's stomach dropped clean through. That's a lie. All 3 of those are lies. The Mokpo witness gave me evidence voluntarily, of his own accord, because he'd been threatened by people connected to the claim. I believe you, Suarez said, and something in the flat certainty of it steadied her, briefly. But the firm has a legal exposure problem regardless of whether it's true, because the complaint came with a threat to pull all of Kim Group's business. Not just this claim, all of it, 11 active files across 3 of our offices, if we don't remove you from the case within 72 hours. He looked at her with an expression that was, she understood, as close to an apology as a man in his position could offer. I have to open an internal review. I don't have a choice. I need you to hand me everything you have on this file today, and I need you to stay away from the Kim residence and any Kim Group personnel until the review clears you. She left Suarez's office with her hands shaking and called Kim Min-jae from the elevator, and for the first time in the entire arrangement, she heard something in his voice that sounded, unmistakably, like alarm. Dae-hyun moved, he said. Faster and more directly than I calculated. He's trying to remove you from the investigation entirely before you can finish tracing the plate number back to Seo Yoon's account in a form that would survive legal scrutiny. He's succeeding, Nandi said. I'm off the case as of today, pending review. If the review doesn't clear me, and I don't see how it clears me fast enough to matter, everything I've built collapses. The plate number, the delivery record, Yang Deoksu's statement, all of it becomes the testimony of a discredited investigator with a bribery allegation attached to her name. There was a silence on the line, and when Kim Min-jae spoke again, his voice had gone very quiet and very controlled in the specific way she now recognized as the sound of a man containing something enormous. I need you to come to the residence tonight, he said. Not through the front gate. There's a service entrance on the north side, off Woolmia Row. Cho will meet you there at 9. I have something I need to show you, and I need to do it before Daehyun's people understand how much of what we've found is already documented outside my household's own systems. Min-jae. She used his given name for the first time, and she heard him register it, a small catch in his breathing on the other end of the line. If I walk into that house tonight and this goes wrong, I have a 5-year-old at home with a babysitter who thinks I'm working late at the office. I know, he said. I've already arranged for 2 of Cho's people to be stationed outside your apartment for the evening, without your babysitter's knowledge, in a car she won't notice. I did this an hour ago, the moment I understood what Daehyun's complaint meant. A pause, and something in it carried the particular weight of a man asking permission after having already acted, and knowing it, and choosing to say so anyway rather than let her find out later. I should have asked first. I'm telling you now because I promised you I would tell you everything, and because I would rather you be angry at me for acting too fast than frightened because I didn't act at all. Nandi stood in the elevator with her reflection ghosting pale in the polished steel doors, and thought about the difference between a man who managed people and a man who was, despite every instinct trained into him by a life built on managing people, trying, clumsily, urgently, at real cost to himself, to be honest with her instead. 9 o'clock, she said. North entrance. I'm bringing everything I have, and Min-jae, if this goes wrong tonight, you tell me exactly where that stands. No management, no softened version. I mean that. I understand, he said. Come. Please. She found Thandi's after-school teacher and arranged an early pickup with a made-up excuse about a work emergency, held her daughter tight enough in the hallway that Thandi complained, laughing, about being squeezed like an octopus, and left her with the babysitter with a longer list of instructions than usual and a photograph of Cho's 2 operatives, sent to her phone minutes earlier by Kim Min-jae, so that if anything felt wrong, she would know the difference between protection and threat. The north service entrance was unmarked, a narrow gate set into the hillside's retaining wall, and Cho was waiting exactly where he'd been promised, silent and enormous in the dark, who nodded once at her arrival and led her through a service corridor she hadn't known existed, up a narrow staircase, and into a section of the residence she had never been permitted to see, a private study on the 3rd floor, book-lined, warmly lit, entirely unlike the clean minimalism of the rest of the house. And Nandi understood, standing in the doorway, that this was the one room in the entire property that belonged to Kim Min-jae alone, unshaped by his father's design or the family's collective taste, and that being brought into it meant something she didn't yet have language for. He was standing when she entered. Not sitting, not performing anything, simply standing at his desk in the lamplight, and the sight of him upright, unweighted by the wheelchair's careful theater, hit her with an unexpected force. He looked, for the first time since Pier 14, entirely like himself. I found something this afternoon, he said, without preamble, and slid a folder across the desk toward her. Cho's been running his own quiet investigation into Seo Yoon's movements for the past 3 weeks, parallel to yours, using channels neither Daehyun nor Seo Yoon know exist. He found a second set of financial transfers, not the ones your report traced to Bright Horizon, a different account entirely, opened 4 months ago, funded in 3 installments that correspond, almost exactly, to dates when Daehyun's complaint against you would have needed legal preparation. He watched her open the folder, watched her scan the transaction dates with the particular, focused stillness she brought to every piece of evidence that mattered. She didn't just help him burn the warehouse, Nandi. She's been building the case against you for months, since before the fire, which means the fire was never really about the warehouse at all. Nandi looked up from the folder slowly. What was it about? I think, Kim Min-jae said, and something in his voice had gone very quiet, very careful, the voice of a man arriving at a conclusion he had been resisting for longer than he wanted to admit, that the fire was designed to fail in exactly the way it did, visible enough to damage my standing with the council, contained enough that no one died, suspicious enough that it would require an outside investigator. And I think Seo Yoon made certain, through channels I haven't fully traced yet, that the investigator assigned to this specific claim would be you. The room went very still. Why me? Because you're competent and thorough, and because, I believe though I can't yet prove it, she anticipated that a woman raising a child alone in a foreign country, with no family here and a career built on discretion, would be easier to discredit and remove than someone with deeper institutional protection. He held her gaze, and something in his face carried the specific weight of a man delivering a truth he knew would cost him something to say. I think you were meant to find just enough to be dangerous, and then be destroyed for finding it, in a way that would make the entire fire investigation collapse along with your credibility. I think this was never only an attack on me, Nandi. I think it was built, from very early on, to also be an attack on you. Nandi sat down slowly in the chair across from his desk, the folder still open in her lap, and felt something cold and clarifying move through her chest. Not fear exactly, though fear was in it somewhere, but something closer to the specific, focused anger she had felt 15 years ago standing in her uncle's burned shop, the anger that had built her entire career, the anger that had taught her, a long time ago, that the only answer to being underestimated was to become the most careful, most patient, most exact version of herself that the underestimating had ever encountered. Then we don't let it work, she said. Kim Min-jae looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression, relief, and something else beneath the relief that neither of them named yet, settled into the lamplight of the small room like a held breath finally released. No, he said. We don't. He came around the desk and sat in the chair beside her rather than behind it, and for the next 2 hours, with the household asleep around them and Cho standing silent guard outside the door, they built, piece by piece, the thing that would have to happen next. A plan that required her professional review to clear in days rather than weeks, that required the second financial trail to reach the right investigator inside the fire marshal's office before Dae-hyun's people could bury it, that required Kim Min-jae to abandon the performance of weakness at precisely the moment it would do the most damage to abandon it, in front of the fewest number of witnesses and the maximum amount of proof. It was well past midnight when Nandi finally rose to leave, and Kim Min-jae walked her to the service entrance himself, past Cho, out into the cold hillside air with the lights of Songdo spread out below them like something scattered and glittering and entirely indifferent to the two of them standing there. Nandi, he said, as she reached the gate, and something in the way he said her name made her turn back. Whatever happens in the next week, the review, the council, all of it, I want you to know that finding you at that warehouse was the first thing in 3 years that happened to me that I didn't calculate, arrange, or see coming. I don't entirely know what to do with that. I wanted to say it once, plainly, before things become more complicated than they already are. Nandi looked at him for a long moment in the dark, this careful, controlled, exhausted man who had just handed her, without any performance in it at all, the single most unguarded thing he'd said to her since she'd met him. I don't know what to do with it either, she said honestly. But I'm not walking away from it. Not yet. She drove home through the empty streets of Incheon with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind turning over everything they had built in that lamplit study, and she did not yet know, could not yet know, that Han Seo-yoon, 3 floors below them in the same house, had spent that entire evening watching a service corridor camera she had quietly installed herself 2 months earlier, and had seen every minute of it. The camera Han Seo-yoon had installed in the North Service corridor 2 months earlier fed into a private server she'd set up herself, unknown to Cho, unknown to the rest of Kim Min-jae's security apparatus, unknown even to Dae-hyun, because Han Seo-yoon had, somewhere in the 11 years she had spent quietly serving 2 masters, learned the one lesson that mattered most in a house like this one. The person who watches everyone is the only person who is never surprised. What she saw on the footage that night, Kim Min-jae standing, unweighted, unbandaged, entirely undiminished, walking Nandi Khumalo to the north gate with his own 2 legs under a clear autumn sky, told her everything she needed to know, and it told her fast enough that she had already made 3 phone calls before the sun rose the next morning. Nandi didn't learn about the footage until 2 days later, when her professional review at Hansung Marine concluded with unusual, almost suspicious speed. Cleared, fully, all 3 allegations found to be unsubstantiated. The bribery claim in particular dismantled within hours once Suarez's own internal counsel discovered that the supposed witness to the alleged bribe didn't exist in any of Hansung's employment records, past or present. She should have felt relief. Instead, standing in Suarez's office reading the clearance letter, she felt the specific, prickling unease of a fight that had ended too easily, and she called Kim Min-jae from the parking garage the moment she was alone. "They dropped it," she said. "All 3 complaints. Withdrawn this morning, no explanation given." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that she knew, before he even spoke, that the news wasn't good. "They didn't drop it because they lost interest," Kim Min-jae said finally. "They dropped it because they no longer need it. Cho found the camera in the North Corridor an hour ago. Seo-yoon knows I can walk. Which means Dae-hyun knows. Which means the strategy that required me to appear weak is finished, because the only people it was designed to fool have already seen through it." His voice had lost the careful flatness she'd come to associate with his control, and underneath it now was something sharper, more urgent. "They'll move for the council vote today. Not next week. Today, while they still believe they have the advantage of surprise, before I can finish building the case in a form the council will accept." "What do you need?" "I need everything," he said. "The plate number tied to Bright Horizon. The Mokpo statement, notarized properly this time, with Yang Deok-soo willing to appear in person if it comes to it. The second financial trail Cho found. All of it, assembled into something a family council of 11 people, most of whom have spent decades not wanting to know the details of anything, will find impossible to look away from." A pause. "I need it by 4 o'clock this afternoon. The council convenes at 5. Nandi looked at the clock on her dashboard. It was 11:40 in the morning. She had, in theory, 4 hours and 20 minutes to build, from raw pieces scattered across 2 investigations and a widowed watchman's shaking testimony, something that could survive the scrutiny of 11 people whose entire lives had been built on not asking uncomfortable questions. "I need Investigator Bay," she said. "And I need somewhere quiet with a printer and nobody looking over my shoulder." "My study," Kim Min-jae said immediately. "Come now. I'll have Bay brought in through the same entrance you used 2 nights ago." The next 4 hours were, Nandi would think later, some of the most focused of her professional life. The kind of concentrated, adrenaline-clear work she hadn't done since her earliest years in the field, when every claim had felt like a test of whether she deserved to be trusted with the next one. Investigator Bay arrived with the full fire marshal's file and, more importantly, with her own quiet, off-the-record notes on the accelerant chemistry, which corroborated, point by point, everything Nandi's delivery record and Yang Deok-soo's statement suggested. Cho brought the financial documents his own investigation had surfaced, laid out on the study's long table in a sequence that made the shape of the conspiracy, finally, undeniable to anyone willing to look. The vehicle registered to Bright Horizon, the payments to Yang Deok-soo's watching men traced through 3 shell accounts back to Han Seo-yoon's personal signature authority, the complaint against Nandi filed and prepared weeks before it was submitted, timed precisely to the moment Kim Min-jae's performed weakness would have made him least able to defend her. At 4:52 in the afternoon, 8 minutes before the council was scheduled to convene, Nandi stood at the long table with a completed file in her hands and looked at Kim Min-jae, dressed now in a dark, unadorned suit, the wheelchair abandoned, his shoulders set in a way she hadn't seen since the pier. "You don't have to bring me into that room," she said. "You could present this yourself. It would carry more weight coming from the family." "It would carry more weight," Kim Min-jae agreed, "and it would also be a lie about how this was actually found, and I am done building anything on top of a lie, even a small, convenient one." He held her gaze steadily. "You found the delivery record. You found the watchman. You traced the plate. This case exists because you refused to stop asking the question everyone else had already decided not to ask. If I stand in that room and let the council believe I did this alone, I become exactly the kind of man Dae-hyun and Seo-yoon have spent months trying to prove I am. Someone who takes what other people build and wears it as his own. He offered her his arm, an old-fashioned gesture that looked, on him, entirely unpracticed and entirely sincere. Come with me. Let them see who actually found the truth. The council chamber was a long, formal room on the residence's second floor, 11 chairs arranged around a table of dark polished wood, and when Kim Min-jae walked in, upright, steady, entirely undiminished, the room's temperature changed instantly, visibly, the particular collective recalculation of a group of powerful people discovering, all at once, that the story they'd been told was not the story that was actually true. Kim Dae-hyun was on his feet before the door had fully closed. This is, Min-jae, your physician confirmed. My physician confirmed what I asked him to confirm, Kim Min-jae said, his voice carrying easily through the room without needing to rise. I apologize to the council for the deception. I do not apologize for the reason behind it. He gestured to Nandi, standing at his side with the file in her hands, and introduced her, formally, by full title and firm, in a way that made clear to everyone in the room that she was there not as a guest but as the architect of what was about to happen. 11 weeks ago, a warehouse containing 4.2 billion won of our cargo burned in a fire that our own fire marshal's report flagged, in a footnote no one pursued, as inconsistent with an accidental cause. I asked Ms. Khumalo to pursue it anyway, because it was her job, and because, unlike everyone at this table, she had no reason to protect anyone whose name might appear at the end of that footnote. Han Seo-yoon, seated near the far end of the table, had gone very still, her composure held with visible, deliberate effort, and Nandi watched her the way she'd watched every dangerous thing in this house. Carefully, without flinching, cataloguing every small shift. Nandi laid the file open on the table and walked the council through it the way she would have walked any client through any claim. Clean, factual, no speculation dressed up as certainty, the delivery record with its off-hours signature, the license plate traced through Bright Horizons registration, the payments routed through 3 shell accounts back to a signature authority that belonged, unambiguously, to Han Seo-yoon, and the complaint against her own professional conduct, filed and prepared weeks in advance of its submission, time to remove the one outside investigator capable of connecting all of it. I want to be clear about something, Nandi said, when she'd finished, looking around the table at 11 faces arranged in various states of shock, calculation, and, in a few cases, she noted, something that looked almost like relief, the expression of people who had suspected something wrong for a long time and had simply been waiting for someone else to be brave enough to say it. This isn't a family dispute I'm choosing a side in. This is arson that endangered workers in an adjacent building, and financial fraud that used a threatened man's family debts as leverage to make him complicit in a crime he didn't understand he was committing. Whatever this council decides about succession is not my business. What happened at Pier 14 is a matter for the fire marshal's office and, eventually, the courts, regardless of what this table decides tonight. The silence that followed was total. Kim Dae-hyun's face had gone the particular gray-white of a man watching a structure he had spent 11 years building collapse in real time, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of the easy, practiced warmth Nandi had encountered at the dinner table weeks earlier. This is manufactured, he said. A discredited investigator and a jealous cousin, working together too. The investigator was cleared this morning by her own firm's internal review, Kim Min-jae said, cutting through the objection with a calm that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. Cleared, specifically, of the exact complaint your office filed against her, once it was discovered that the witness named in your complaint doesn't exist. If you would like to explain to this council how a witness who doesn't exist came to be named in a formal legal filing bearing your office's signature, I am happy to give you the floor. Han Seo-yoon rose from her chair, slowly, and for a moment Nandi thought she might simply walk out, the composed, dignified exit of a woman declining to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. Instead she looked at Kim Min-jae for a long moment, and something in her face, briefly, was not calculation at all but something closer to genuine, unguarded grief. I did what was necessary, she said quietly, to the room, to him, to no one in particular. You would have done the same, in my position, 11 years ago, if the arrangement had been reversed. Perhaps, Kim Min-jae said. But it wasn't reversed. And I would like to think I would have found a way that didn't require setting fire to a building with people sleeping in the next unit over, or trying to destroy the reputation of a woman whose only crime was doing her job honestly. His voice did not rise, did not sharpen, and somehow that made the words land harder than shouting would have. You have 30 minutes to contact your own legal counsel before I hand this file to the fire marshal's office formally. I am extending you that courtesy because of the years we shared, not because I believe you've earned it. She left the room without another word. Dae-hyun followed a moment later, his composure in visible pieces, already speaking in a low, urgent voice into his phone before he'd cleared the doorway, and the council chamber settled, slowly, into the particular quiet that follows an earthquake. The furniture unchanged, the light unchanged, but the air carrying a charge that hadn't been there an hour before. The months that followed moved the way these things always moved once the initial fire was out. Not cleanly, not quickly, but steadily, through the grinding, unglamorous machinery of process. Han Seo-yoon's legal team negotiated a cooperation agreement that traded detailed testimony against Dae-hyun for reduced charges of her own, testimony that ultimately implicated not just the warehouse fire but 2 earlier incidents Nandi's firm had quietly closed as accidents years before her arrival in Incheon, cases that would now, finally, be reopened. Kim Dae-hyun was removed from the family council within the week, his shares placed under formal trust management pending the outcome of a criminal investigation that would occupy prosecutors for the better part of a year. Young Deok-soo testified in the end, not because he was compelled to but because he told Nandi, in a phone call from Mokpo 3 weeks after the council meeting, that he had finally slept a full night for the first time since the fire, and he wanted to keep sleeping that way. Nandi's firm closed the Pier 14 claim in the 9th week, paid in full, without further dispute, and Suarez told her, in a conversation that was as close to an apology as he was constitutionally capable of, that the firm's board had specifically asked that her name be attached to the files. Closing summary as a model of thorough, uncompromised investigative work. The kind of formal, institutional acknowledgement that meant, she understood, considerably more to her career than the number attached to the claim itself. She saw Kim Min-jae twice during those months, both times briefly, both times surrounded by the practical machinery of a business in the middle of its own careful reconstruction. New security protocols, a restructured council, a legal team working through the slow, methodical process of separating what Kim Group Holdings had legitimately built from what Dae-hyun's shadow network had grafted onto it over the years. He was, she noted each time, visibly lighter in some fundamental way she couldn't fully name, a man who had set down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing its shape, and who was still, carefully, relearning what it felt like to stand up straight without it. It was late spring, nearly 6 months after the fire, when he called her. Not about the case, not about anything requiring a folder or a signature, just a call, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, asking, with a formality that made her smile despite herself, whether she and Thandi would be willing to come to a small gathering he was hosting the following weekend. Nothing corporate, nothing that required a title or a badge. Just an afternoon in the garden of the Songdo house, which he mentioned almost as an aside, recently had replanted after the previous years had never really suited him. Thandi arrived that Saturday in her best dress, insisted upon after a full 10 minutes of negotiation, and spent the first 20 minutes of the visit interrogating Kim Min-jae with the total, unembarrassed seriousness of a 5-year-old conducting an important inquiry, wanting to know whether he had ever actually been on a container ship, and if not, why not, given that he apparently owned several. "I've been on many," Kim Min-jae told her, with the same grave attention he'd once given a warehouse fire, crouching to her eye level in a way that made something in Nandi's chest go soft and unguarded. "Would you like to see one someday? I could arrange it." Thandi considered this offer with the gravity of a treaty negotiation. "Can Bekani come too?" "Bekani is welcome aboard," Kim Min-jae said solemnly, and Thandi, apparently satisfied that the terms were acceptable, ran off toward the newly planted flower beds to conduct further inspections, leaving the 2 adults standing together in the late afternoon light with the sea glittering faintly beyond the hillside below. "She likes you," Nandi said. "She's easier to be honest with than most of the people I've known my whole life," Kim Min-jae said, watching Thandi crouch over something in the flower bed with total absorption. "I find I prefer it that way." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had the careful, deliberate quality she'd learned to recognize as the sound of a man saying something he'd rehearsed more than once and still found difficult to say plainly. I don't know exactly what this is, between us. I've spent 6 months being honest with you about nearly everything, and I find I don't know how to be honest about this particular thing without it sounding like a business proposal, which is the last thing I want it to sound like. Nandi looked out at the garden, at her daughter crouched happily among flowers that hadn't existed a year ago, at the water beyond the hill catching the last of the afternoon light, and thought about a burned warehouse and a shaking watchman's teacup and a lamplit study at midnight and a man who had, at every turn where it would have been easier to manage her instead, chosen instead to simply tell her the truth. You don't have to make it sound like anything, she said. You could just say it plainly, the way you say everything else that actually matters to you. Something in Kim Min-jae's face eased, the particular unguarded softening she'd only seen from him twice before, once in a lamplit study, once at a north gate with the city glittering below them, and he said, simply, without any performance in it at all, I would like this to become something ordinary. Something that doesn't require a fire or a council vote or a crisis to justify it. I would like, very much, to simply be someone you and Thandi see on Saturdays, and see what that becomes, without either of us calculating what it's worth. Nandi thought about 15 years of standing in the ash of other people's disasters, reading the truth in what refused to burn cleanly, and thought that this, a man choosing, deliberately, to want something ordinary after a lifetime built on never trusting anything that wasn't calculated, was its own kind of evidence, the kind she'd trust more than any document, because it cost him something to say and he'd said it anyway. I'd like that too, she said. Thandi came running back across the garden a moment later, breathless, holding out a single, slightly crushed flower with both hands, presenting it to Kim Min-jae with the total seriousness of a diplomat delivering a treaty. He took it from her with both hands, exactly as gravely as it was offered, and Nandi stood in the late spring light watching the two of them, her daughter and this careful, exacting, quietly transformed man, and thought that some things, in the end, really were as simple as a watchman finally sleeping through the night, or a fire finally telling the whole truth to someone patient enough to read it, or a man choosing honesty over management, one small, deliberate moment at a time, until it became, at last, something ordinary enough to build a life on.